The year was 1968, a year already weighted with turbulence on the surface of the world, yet in the Pacific Ocean it was silence that reigned supreme. Beneath the endless horizon of steel-grey water, a submarine slipped away from its berth, unseen by most eyes, acknowledged only by the faint churn of foam trailing its descent into secrecy. It was a vessel built for endurance, for precision and for vanishing, designed to inhabit the unseen layers of the sea where sunlight could not reach. Its men carried within them the steady discipline of routine, the kind of ritual that came from both training and the unspoken understanding that once the hatches closed, their fates were bound together in steel and in silence. The submarine moved like an animal bred for shadows, sleek and purposeful, its hull cutting across currents in ways invisible to the surface. It carried with it the tension of the Cold War, though none aboard would have described it in those terms. For them it was simply duty, a mission marked on paper and explained with the matter-of-fact tone of command. Yet in the details, the specific coordinates, the careful instructions, the classified appendices, there lay a reminder that routine was never truly routine when the world's greatest powers measured their strength through the movements of machines like this. The ocean accepted the submarine without ceremony. Above, storms shifted across the horizon, winds bent against each other in the restless patterns of the Pacific, but down below there was only stillness. The steel bulkheads insulated the crew from the immensity pressing against them, though the truth lingered in every vibration of the hull. Millions of tons of water waited on the other side, patient and eternal. The men inside moved through the narrow corridors with practiced efficiency, their tasks woven into the rhythm of hums, clicks, and the faint background drone of machinery. The smell of oil and metal clung to the air, the kind that would become invisible after days aboard, yet always remained a reminder of confinement. For the Navy, the departure marked nothing unusual. Ships came and went, assignments shifted, and orders were filed into the great machinery of bureaucracy. But there was something about this vessel, about the way it left harbor and did not return, that would later lodge itself in history's memory. The submarine did not announce itself with fanfare. It disappeared into the folds of routine, into the calendar of duty, into the map of the ocean where countless routes intersected and vanished. Its crew of over 90 souls lived and worked within its confines, their stories folding into the steel walls, their lives reduced to log entries, timestamps, and the faint scratches of handwriting in journals never recovered. The first hours passed in monotony, as they always did. The submarine adjusted to depth, the instruments aligned, and reports were delivered. Every system responded, every measurement confirmed, and the mission unfolded with precision. The men carried their roles like actors in a play endlessly rehearsed, engineers monitoring gauges, navigators tracing courses, officers cross-checking procedures. Beyond the routine, there was little to distinguish one day from another, except perhaps the awareness that each dive into the depths was a journey into both trust and uncertainty. Beneath the silence of operations, the ocean carried its own indifference. It was an environment where sound traveled farther than light, where distance became meaningless, and where the pressure of depth grew heavier with every fathom. No human eye could penetrate the dark plains of the seabed. No hand could touch the ridges of volcanic scars that lay beneath. It was a world untouched, yet profoundly dangerous, and the submarine's presence there was as fragile as a candle in a cavernous night. The men trusted the steel, but even steel had its limits. Though no one aboard could have foreseen the fate awaiting them, history would later pause at this departure. The submarine's final voyage began not with spectacle, but with ordinary motion. Yet even in its ordinariness there was something haunting. The silence of the sea, the calmness of the crew, the predictable rhythm of departure, all were fragments that would later be sifted for meaning. For in that silence lay the beginning of the most mysterious disappearance the Navy had ever recorded. A vanishing act staged not on a battlefield or in a storm, but in the unbroken quiet of the deep. As night fell upon the surface above, the submarine pressed forward into the darkness, its lights dimmed, its engines steady. The men inside settled into the endless repetition of watches, meals, maintenance, and rest. They did not know that these routines, so familiar and so dependable, were being etched into history as their last. They descended into depths that no one else would ever follow them to in life, into a chapter of the sea that remained unwritten until the moment it swallowed them whole. And so in the first hours of its final journey, the submarine carried with it nothing more than silence, duty, and the weight of 99 souls who trusted the steel around them. The ocean accepted them, vast and endless, offering no sign that it would ever let them return. In the months leading to the submarine's departure, the U.S. Navy operated in a climate thick with vigilance and restraint, a reflection of the Cold War's invisible front lines. Every deployment was framed not merely as a mission, but as a statement, a silent maneuver in a global contest, defined by deterrence, secrecy, and the constant awareness that one miscalculation beneath the seas could ripple upward into international crisis. To those entrusted with command, the ocean was not only geography, but also battlefield, laboratory, and graveyard, a stage where nations measured one another without ever exchanging direct fire. The submarine had been prepared with the precision of ritual. Its systems were inspected, its supplies inventoried, its men briefed with the clipped efficiency of officers accustomed to repeating procedures designed to leave no room for doubt. Each action was logged, each confirmation signed, each line of instruction reinforced until it seemed unbreakable. Yet beneath that order lay the recognition that unpredictability was the true constant of the sea. Submarines were made to vanish from detection, but their invisibility came with the risk of their disappearance, extending beyond intention, slipping not just past adversaries, but past the grasp of their own command. The Navy followed its vessel's progress through scheduled reports and coded transmissions. Each update was brief, functional, stripped of anything unnecessary, the language of machinery and navigation rather than of men and their lives. These messages reassured headquarters, marking the submarine's presence like faint footprints across the floor of an ocean too vast to control. They appeared at intervals on the charts of operations officers, small reminders that steel and crew were still intact, still moving along the track of mission and return. To the families waiting at home, there were no such reminders, only the knowledge that absence itself was proof of service. For them, silence was expected, and silence was endured. Inside naval offices, however, silence had a different weight. It could mean efficiency, a vessel slipping through shadows unseen. But it could also signal danger. The ocean concealed everything indiscriminately, secrets, machines, entire histories, and once something disappeared beneath it, discovery was never guaranteed. This truth was understood but rarely spoken aloud. Officers framed deployments as controlled, risks as minimized, procedures as flawless. Yet privately, many accepted the sea's indifference as a factor beyond human command. The submarine's mission, though labeled routine, carried a strategic undertone. Its course was designed to intersect with regions of interest, places where other nations tested their reach, and where American presence was measured not by confrontation, but by proximity. Observation, patrol, and deterrence were its primary functions, yet within those duties was the knowledge that any malfunction, any misjudgment of depth or stress could erase the vessel without warning. Engineers trusted their instruments, navigators trusted their charts, and officers trusted their training. But trust did not bend the physics of pressure or the vastness of the ocean's cloak. The Pacific, wide and indifferent, stretched around the submarine with horizons that seemed eternal. It was a place where storms could erupt in moments, where waves towered and dissolved in endless succession, and where beneath the surface lay a labyrinth of trenches, mountains and plains that no vessel had fully charted. The men aboard carried no illusions of mastery over such terrain. Their task was survival within it, guided by sonar echoes and readings that translated unknowable landscapes into faint lines of comprehension. The deeper they traveled, the less the outside world resembled anything familiar, until the submarine seemed more like an isolated planet adrift in blackness than a ship bound to Earth. Within the Navy's command structure, the vessel's progress was routine enough that it drew little direct attention in those early days. Dozens of ships moved across oceans at any given moment, each with its orders, its logs, its reporting schedules. The submarine was one among many, yet its role was crucial because invisibility was its nature. To be unremarkable was to succeed. Reports marked its movement without elaboration, dates and times checked against expectations, no cause for concern. But in hindsight, those ordinary transmissions acquired a quality of fragility, each one a vanishing echo, each one a bead on a thread that would soon be broken. On board, time folded into itself. Hours became indistinguishable from days as men worked in shifts, resting in cramped quarters, eating in cycles that bore little relation to daylight above. They lived by machinery's rhythm, the turn of gears and the whine of systems, the background thrum of engines that lulled and reassured by its constancy. They carried personal objects, photographs tucked into lockers, folded letters, books worn from use, but these reminders of the surface world existed only as fragments, pieces of light within the confinement of steel. Beyond them stretched water without boundary, pressure without mercy, and a silence so complete that only the vessel's hum reminded them of life. The ocean wrapped itself around the submarine like a veil, not hostile but absolute. It was a place where sound carried across distances unimaginable on land, where a dropped wrench could echo into miles of darkness, and where silence became the most valuable shield. This veil concealed them from adversaries and shielded them from observation. But it also separated them from everything else: command, families, history itself. They moved forward deeper into its folds, unaware that soon the veil would thicken beyond all recognition, until not even their last trace could pierce it. In those days of apparent normalcy, nothing on the surface hinted at the coming rupture. Yet beneath the calm entries of naval logs and the quiet persistence of machinery, the submarine was already on the path to becoming not just a vessel at sea, but a question without answer, swallowed by the veil of the ocean that reveals nothing without demand, and often reveals nothing at all. The third week of the mission carried the same cadence as the first: routine checks, scheduled reports, and the subtle reassurance that silence still meant success. At headquarters, operators logged each message with mechanical precision, stacking them into the archive of transmissions that marked progress across invisible waters. Nothing about them was extraordinary. They were the language of procedure: coordinates confirmed, depth maintained, systems functioning as expected. Yet in the way that history later rewrote their significance, these simple signals would stand as the final known echoes of a vessel soon to vanish into the deep. The last transmissions were unremarkable. They bore no alarm, no indication of mechanical strain, no hint of disruption. They carried the flat tone of procedure, clipped and functional, delivered by men who had no reason to believe they were writing the last chapter of their existence. That ordinariness would later haunt those who studied the case, for it meant that whatever came next arrived without forewarning, sudden and absolute. In the world of submarines, danger usually announced itself: leaks, vibrations, malfunctions detectable by trained ears. But here there was nothing. No gradual decline, only an abrupt erasure from the map of the sea. At the moment the final message reached command, no one noted it as unusual. The submarine was fulfilling its duty, tracing the ocean's surface from beneath, following its charted path. The transmission was logged, filed, acknowledged. A new day began, and operations shifted toward other ships, other missions, the rolling machinery of a navy always in motion. Hours later, when the next scheduled report failed to arrive, there was still no urgency. Delays happened. Equipment faltered, signals wavered, storms interfered. Submarines often re-emerged from gaps in communication, with steady explanations that dissolved worry into routine once more. But as hours stretched further, the silence began to shift in meaning. Officers tracked the gap with growing unease, watching as the absence became measurable, as the space where a report should have been became a void no longer dismissible. Messages were sent, requests repeated, frequencies monitored. The ocean returned nothing. The absence thickened, turning from anomaly to warning. By the second day without contact, the stillness was undeniable. The submarine had stopped speaking. Inside command centers, tension accumulated in quiet increments. Maps were consulted, trajectories calculated, probabilities estimated. What currents might carry wreckage if wreckage there was? What depth lay beneath the last confirmed position? How many hours could pass before silence must be acknowledged as loss? The ocean gave no answers, its expanse as blank as the reports coming back from aircraft and monitoring stations. Yet even before the official alarm was sounded, the last transmissions acquired weight. Officers replayed them, studied their brevity. examined each syllable as though meaning might hide in the cadence. Was there strain in the voice? A hesitation in the timing? Nothing surfaced. The words were empty of emotion, carried in the monotone of protocol, and that emptiness itself became the echo of tragedy. The absence of any sign of struggle meant the end had come swiftly, swallowing both vessel and men before they had time to announce it. For the families of the crew, no transmissions were ever heard. They were accustomed to silence, accustomed to waiting, accustomed to the distance that came with service beneath the ocean. Letters could not reach men submerged for weeks at a time. Only the eventual return of the vessel delivered reassurance. But when reassurance failed to arrive, their silence stretched into a different kind, one filled with fear that refused to remain unspoken. The last signal existed only in Navy archives, unreadable to those who waited at home, yet it was their invisible tether to men who were now gone. The Pacific was vast enough to absorb any disappearance. Its trenches ran deeper than mountains were tall. Its plains extended farther than maps could chart. Its storms churned with violence that erased evidence as though it had never been. Somewhere within that immensity, the submarine had spoken its last words, routine in tone, final in fact. Then it had vanished, as though the ocean had chosen to fold itself back over them, sealing 99 lives within a silence more complete than any protocol could break. The Navy's officers did not yet call it disaster. They called it uncertainty, deviation, possible malfunction. But within the quiet corridors of command, men began to feel the weight of what the silence implied. A ship could be late. A submarine, when it ceased to answer, was often gone. And if it was gone, the ocean would not surrender it easily. Thus the last signal became both anchor and abyss, a timestamp that marked the end of certainty. Everything that followed, the search, the theories, the fragments of data gathered in desperation, would orbit around that single message, the last tether before the abyss. It was ordinary, functional, empty of meaning, yet it became the most studied fragment in the story of the Navy's most mysterious disappearance. The signal ended. The ocean spoke louder, and the men aboard passed into history, leaving behind only the hollow resonance of words that had once meant nothing but routine. At first, the absence was disguised by routine explanations. A storm system moving through the region could account for interference. A malfunction in the communication array was plausible, if not likely. Submarines had been known to fall silent for hours, sometimes even a full day, only to return with the calm assurance that systems had been corrected and all was well. But this time, the silence stretched past every boundary of probability. One day became two and two became three, until even the most disciplined officers had to acknowledge that explanations were dissolving into something heavier. By the fourth day, the command centers no longer masked their unease with technical phrases. Reports of delayed transmission gave way to failure to establish contact, and finally, to communications lost. The words carried a weight that pressed on every desk, every chart, every line of authority. Submarines did not simply vanish. They were machines built to withstand the crushing weight of the deep, staffed by men trained to manage crises under pressure. Yet the ocean had a way of reducing even the strongest designs to fragility. And now one of the Navy's vessels, along with all its crew, had slipped beneath that veil of uncertainty and had not re-emerged. Ships were deployed. Aircraft launched. Reconnaissance widened in every direction from the submarine's last known position. The Navy, accustomed to secrecy in its operations, now moved with urgency under the cover of silence. Official statements were withheld. Families remained uninformed. To announce a disappearance too early was to risk panic, to risk weakness in the eyes of adversaries, to risk acknowledging that even the most advanced machines could be erased by forces unseen. Inside the corridors of command, men pored over maps with compasses and markers, tracing arcs of probability across the Pacific, as though mathematics could summon back what the ocean had claimed. The vanishing point, as later historians would call it, was not a single coordinate but a region, an expanse of ocean where the submarine's last signal had been recorded. It was a patch of sea indistinguishable from thousands of others, its surface unbroken, its depths unexplored. Yet within that featureless water lay the boundary between presence and absence, between known and unknowable. Ships crisscrossed the area, dragging sonar nets across miles of blackness, listening for echoes that never returned. Planes flew above, scanning waves that offered only reflection and glare. Nothing marked the location of a vessel nearly 100 meters long, filled with machinery, supplies, and human lives. It was as though the ocean had swallowed it whole without ripple or remainder. Inside the Navy, questions multiplied faster than answers. Could an internal explosion have occurred? Could a reactor fault have silenced the vessel in an instant? Or was it something external, an adversary's weapon or entanglement in hostile waters? Every possibility carried weight, yet none carried evidence. The absence of wreckage, oil slicks, or debris deepened the mystery, leaving officials to debate theories in rooms where secrecy was paramount and certainty absent. For the families, silence became unbearable. They lived with the unspoken knowledge that contact was never expected during deployment, yet they also knew the rhythm of return, the anticipation of homecoming. When dates passed without word, questions spread through kitchens across neighborhoods, in whispered conversations between spouses who clung to optimism even as dread seeped in. The Navy gave them no confirmation, no denial, only the kind of official stillness that said everything by saying nothing. As the search widened, so too did the weight of realization. The Pacific was too vast, too indifferent, too silent to yield its secrets easily. Every passing day without discovery did more than suggest loss. It cemented it. And so the vanishing point grew from an operational concern into a moment of history, the kind that crystallizes into permanent memory. A submarine, a crew, a mission, all gone without trace, leaving behind only the knowledge that something had occurred in the deep that no one had witnessed, no one had recorded, no one had survived to describe. In that acknowledgement lay the transition from uncertainty to tragedy. What began as an assumption of delay had become, by the close of the first week, a recognition of disappearance. The submarine had crossed a line that few vessels crossed and none returned from. Its last words had been routine. Its absence was absolute. The Navy marked the date, the hour, the position, and in doing so admitted what could no longer be denied. The submarine had vanished, and with it, 99 men whose lives now belonged to the ocean. The vanishing point was not just geographical. It was psychological, institutional, historical. It marked the moment when silence became more powerful than presence, when absence became the story itself. And though the search would continue, and theories would multiply, the truth had already been written in the language of the sea. The submarine was gone, and the ocean had given nothing back. The disappearance of a submarine was unlike the disappearance of any other vessel. A surface ship left traces. Lifeboats, debris, oil slicks drifting in currents. Even aircraft left wreckage that could be sighted by planes scanning from above. But a submarine, when it vanished, became part of the ocean itself, sliding beneath the surface into a silence so complete that no sign lingered to testify to its fate. The Navy understood this reality, and yet it mobilized with relentless urgency, launching one of the most extensive search operations of its time. Within hours of officially recognizing the loss, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and reconnaissance planes were dispatched. The sea above the submarine's last known position became a grid, mapped and divided into search zones. Ships dragged sonar across the deep, while planes circled in widening arcs, their crews staring at the water below for any trace of an oil film, any glimmer of wreckage. Each vessel moved with precision, their paths crossing like threads in an intricate pattern woven over a vast emptiness. Radios crackled with position reports, sightings, corrections, but no confirmation of the missing submarine's fate ever came. In Washington, briefings grew increasingly tense. Intelligence officers brought maps into closed rooms, where admirals debated possibilities. Engineers explained the limits of hull strength, describing how steel surrendered under the crushing weight of the deep if pushed beyond design. Others considered catastrophic internal failures, electrical fires, explosions, ruptures that could erase a vessel in moments. Still others raised darker possibilities, suggesting collisions or hostile action. Each theory was weighed, but none carried the evidence to stand above the rest. All that existed was the void where the submarine had once been. For the searchers at sea, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a mirror of gray and blue by day, an impenetrable black expanse by night. They dropped sonar buoys, released listening devices, tuned instruments to capture faint echoes from the depths. Sometimes anomalies surfaced in the recordings, strange rumbles, distant crashes, faint reverberations traveling along the water. Each anomaly was catalogued, studied, dissected. None could be tied with certainty to the vanished submarine. The ocean seemed to mock the effort, offering fragments of sound that led nowhere, shadows without substance. The families waited without answers. They were not told of the search in its full scope, only that the Navy was working tirelessly. Days bled into weeks, and the absence pressed harder. In living rooms and kitchens across the country, photographs of the missing men sat on mantels, their smiles frozen in time. Wives explained the uncertainty to children too young to understand why their fathers had not returned. Parents sat by telephones, hoping for word that never came. For them, the Pacific was not a distant theater of strategy. It was a wall, an expanse that had stolen their sons and would not give them back. The search expanded beyond naval vessels. Intelligence agencies listened for undersea signals, drawing upon monitoring systems positioned around the globe, networks designed to detect the acoustic signatures of nuclear tests. If an explosion had occurred, those instruments might have recorded it. Analysts pored over reels of sound, lines of waveforms, looking for a singular disturbance that might mark the final moment of the submarine. There were hints, low-frequency patterns captured in the vast distances of the ocean. Yet the data was never absolute, never complete, always leaving room for uncertainty. The sea's own noise, earthquakes, shifting tectonic plates, even the song of whales, complicated every attempt to isolate the truth. As the search continued, the Navy understood a grim reality. If the submarine had been lost at extreme depth, the likelihood of recovery was negligible. No diver could reach those levels. No salvage ship could operate against pressures so immense that steel was compressed as though it were paper. To admit this publicly would be to admit defeat. So instead the operation carried on, methodical and unyielding. Ships scoured the ocean floor with sonar, mapping terrain no human eye had ever seen, but the submarine remained hidden, as if the Pacific had decided to keep its secret, sealed within its trenches. By the close of the first month, the searchers were exhausted, their efforts yielding no more than speculation and disappointment. Yet the operation did not stop. Pride, duty, and grief propelled it forward. The Navy could not allow the disappearance of an entire crew to remain unanswered, not when the eyes of the world were upon them. The Cold War lent every action weight beyond tragedy, for any suggestion of foreign involvement carried consequences far greater than the loss itself. And so the search continued, tracing ever-widening arcs across the Pacific, scanning trenches that reached deeper than Everest was tall, listening to the ocean's endless song of shifting currents and groaning earth. The men and machines worked against an opponent that gave nothing in return. What had begun as a rescue mission had transformed into something more desperate, more symbolic, a struggle to wrest even a fragment of truth from the ocean's silence. But truth would not come easily. For every mile of sea covered, thousands remained untouched. The submarine was somewhere out there, intact or shattered, silent but present, and until it was found, the mystery of its disappearance would deepen, drawing into itself not only the grief of families and the frustration of officers, but the fascination of history itself. The sea did not surrender bodies, nor fragments of steel nor oil drifting on its surface. Yet the Navy's analysts began to turn their focus towards something less tangible, but perhaps more telling: sound. The ocean was not silent, though to human ears it seemed so from the deck of a ship. Beneath the surface it was alive with noise. The shifting of tectonic plates, the rumble of distant storms, the calling songs of whales, and the occasional crash of ice breaking from distant shelves. In this vast chorus of natural sound, human machines left their own imprints. Submarines, torpedoes, and detonations all carried signatures that could be detected by instruments tuned to the language of the deep. In the late 1960s, the United States had already developed a network of listening stations known only to a select few. It was part of a global system designed to monitor nuclear testing, its hydrophones sensitive enough to catch low-frequency sounds, traveling thousands of miles through the ocean's sound channel. It was within these archives of recordings that analysts began to search, combing through hours of underwater noise, hoping for a clue hidden in the endless reverberations of the sea. What they found was not clarity but fragments, anomalies, disturbances that broke the steady background. One pattern in particular drew attention: a deep, low-frequency thud followed by a cascading series of echoes, recorded across multiple stations, separated by hundreds of miles. The timing placed it within hours of the submarine's last known transmission. To some, it was unmistakable, the acoustic footprint of a catastrophic event, perhaps an implosion under crushing pressure. The sound had traveled through the Pacific, carrying with it the echo of steel surrendering to forces it was never meant to endure. For days, teams analyzed the waveform, measuring intervals, comparing it against known data from tests and accidents. The physics seemed to align. If the submarine had descended beyond safe limits, if its hull had failed under the weight, the collapse would have generated precisely such a signal. It was as though the ocean itself had whispered the truth, but only to those with ears trained to hear it. Yet certainty remained elusive. The recordings were not perfect, and the sea distorted everything. Some argued that the signal might have been geological, an undersea earthquake, a landslide on a distant slope. Others insisted the resonance bore the hallmark of metal under stress. The debate never settled, and the anomaly remained suspended between theory and evidence, a ghost of sound hovering over silence. For those who searched, the discovery deepened rather than relieved the mystery. If the submarine had imploded, it explained why nothing had surfaced, why there were no oil slicks, no fragments of wreckage. An implosion at depth would have erased the vessel in an instant, compressing it into ruin under thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. There would be no survivors, no signals sent, no time for alarms, only silence. But the acoustic clue raised another question. What had driven the submarine into such peril? Was it mechanical failure, human error, or something external? Without wreckage, the cause could never be confirmed. As reports circulated through classified channels, the families remained outside the knowledge, told only that the submarine was missing, presumed lost. They did not hear of acoustic anomalies or sound channels. To them, whispers beneath the waves were not data but metaphor, the sense that the ocean itself had swallowed voices they would never hear again. In their homes, they clung to photographs and letters, replaying in memory the sound of voices that had been silenced not by distance but by absence. Meanwhile, within the Navy's offices, the whispers became the focal point of speculation. Charts were redrawn to estimate where the sound might have originated, though triangulation across the vast Pacific carried wide margins of error. Circles of probability were sketched across the map, overlapping zones that stretched across thousands of square miles. Somewhere within those arcs, the submarine had met its fate. Ships were dispatched to those regions, dragging sonar across abyssal plains, but the depth was beyond easy reach. The Pacific's trenches descended farther than any diver could travel, farther even than most machines of the era could safely explore. The search vessels returned with nothing, their sonar scans tracing only the natural formations of the seabed. Ridges, cliffs, and valleys untouched for millions of years. Still, the whispers carried weight. They suggested an end, however elusive, and gave shape to the silence that had haunted the Navy since the last signal. It was not the closure of certainty, but it was a direction, a theory that could be clung to in the absence of proof. For some, it was enough to believe that the submarine's death had been swift, that the men aboard had not suffered long. For others, the lack of final evidence left the mystery unresolved, an open wound that no theory could heal. The Pacific remained indifferent. Its waves broke on shorelines continents apart, unaware of the arguments they carried within them. Its depths held their secrets tightly, offering only faint echoes to those who sought to understand. And so the searchers were left with little more than whispers, fragile suggestions of truth, drowned in a sea that refused to reveal its story. The submarine's silence was no longer only a naval tragedy. It was becoming a matter of state. The Cold War had twisted every disappearance into a potential signal, every loss into a possible act of espionage or aggression. Within the Pentagon, the unanswered question of what had happened beneath the Pacific carried not just grief but suspicion. To admit the submarine had imploded by accident was to expose vulnerability in American engineering, a flaw in the image of invincibility that submarines represented. To admit the possibility of hostile action was to risk escalation with consequences too vast to measure. And so the official response was wrapped in secrecy. The truth, whatever fragments of it existed, shrouded in classified reports that would not see daylight for years. Inside secure rooms, officers studied the data with expressions that betrayed little. Maps were pinned to walls, marked with circles of probability where the submarine might have fallen. Acoustic charts lay spread across tables, their jagged lines debated by men who understood what they suggested, but hesitated to state aloud. Some pointed to mechanical explanations, a faulty valve, a reactor malfunction, or a torpedo accident. Others raised darker possibilities, suggesting the submarine had wandered too close to Soviet waters, where a confrontation might have occurred unseen. The lack of evidence allowed both theories to grow, and in the vacuum, speculation thrived. Pressure came not only from the depths of the ocean but from above, from political offices, where leaders demanded certainty that could not be provided. The president himself was briefed, not in detail but in the broad strokes of loss. He was told that a vessel had vanished, that families would need answers, that adversaries must not suspect weakness. Behind those words lay the reality that the submarine's disappearance could be interpreted as failure, and failure could not be allowed to define the narrative. The official line, therefore, was cautious. The Navy was conducting extensive search operations, and nothing further could yet be confirmed. For the families, this silence felt like betrayal. They read newspapers that speculated wildly, some hinting at disaster, others claiming the submarine was still on patrol. The truth, carefully contained within layers of classification, was not for them to know. Wives received letters of sympathy but no details. Children heard whispers in their communities, but no one offered explanation. Parents stared at military representatives who could only repeat the phrase missing, presumed lost. Grief was compounded by ignorance, and ignorance by secrecy. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Soviet intelligence observed the American search with equal intensity. They tracked naval movements, noted the concentration of ships and aircraft, and speculated in their own corridors of command. The disappearance of a U.S. submarine was both opportunity and puzzle. Had the Americans lost control of their own vessel? Or had something occurred in contested waters that might reveal more than the Americans wished to admit? The Soviets offered no comment publicly, but in silence they, too, measured the disappearance for advantage. Within the Navy itself, men who had once served alongside those aboard the missing submarine carried the weight differently. They understood the mechanics of the vessel, the risks inherent in its design, the pressures of the deep. For them, theories were not political but personal. They imagined the sound of steel buckling, the sudden blackout of lights, the abruptness with which everything familiar could be replaced by water and crushing dark. Yet even they could not speak freely. Their understanding was bound by the same secrecy that cloaked the official investigation, leaving them to grieve in silence as the institution weighed national image against human loss. The ocean remained the most powerful conspirator in the mystery. It gave no wreckage to confirm mechanical failure, no debris to suggest attack, no survivors to testify. It allowed only speculation, and speculation under the weight of politics became something more than curiosity. It became danger. For in the absence of answers, the void was filled by suspicion, and suspicion was a currency the Cold War traded in heavily. Thus, the submarine's disappearance became more than tragedy. It became a test of endurance, not of steel against pressure, but of truth against secrecy. Families waited for answers that would never fully come. Officers drafted reports that concealed more than they revealed. Politicians weighed how much to admit, how much to deny, how much to leave unsaid. And in the midst of it all, the ocean kept its silence, a silence deeper than any secrecy the Navy could impose. The men aboard the submarine had already been claimed by the sea. But above the waves, their absence began to shape policy, strategy, and perception. The weight of 99 lives became intertwined with the weight of a global rivalry, and the line between tragedy and politics blurred until they were inseparable. The submarine had vanished, but its shadow stretched far beyond its steel hull, pressing on leaders and families alike, as unyielding as the water that had taken it. Weeks passed, and the Pacific offered nothing to those who sought its secrets. The search vessels moved in long, deliberate patterns, their sonar beams scanning the unseen depths. Yet the sea floor remained hidden, shrouded by darkness and pressure no human could withstand. Still slowly, a theory began to take hold among investigators. The submarine had gone too deep, descending past the threshold its hull could endure, until the steel itself had been crushed under the unimaginable weight of the ocean. Engineers explained what such a failure would mean. Submarines were designed with tolerances, margins of safety calculated into every weld and plate. But even steel had limits, and the deeper the descent, the more merciless the pressure became. At a certain point, measured in fathoms, the walls of the vessel would buckle inward with catastrophic speed. An implosion of this kind would happen in less than a second, faster than the crew could comprehend, faster than any hand could reach for an alarm. 99 men would have been extinguished in an instant, the air within their vessel collapsing, the sea rushing to reclaim the space that had once held life. It was a grim explanation, but one that fit both the acoustic whispers detected by the Navy's listening stations and the absence of debris on the surface. An implosion would not scatter wreckage across the waves. It would consume everything, leaving only fragments that drifted downward into the blackness, settling on the ocean floor far beyond reach. The submarine would remain there, broken and silent, a graveyard of steel resting in darkness where no sunlight had ever penetrated. The officers tasked with drafting reports faced a difficult balance. To acknowledge catastrophic failure was to admit vulnerability, to reveal that even American engineering could be undone by the sea. Yet to deny it was to leave the mystery unaddressed, fueling speculation of collision or attack. They chose their words carefully, crafting statements that acknowledged loss without explaining it. Missing, presumed sunk, became the official phrase, a line that conveyed finality while concealing the mechanics of the tragedy. Families were told only that the submarine would not return. The details, if they were details at all, remained classified, sealed away in files stamped with secrecy. For those families, imagination filled the gaps. Some clung to the idea that the end had been swift, that their loved ones had not suffered, that the implosion had erased consciousness before fear could take hold. Others refused to accept the explanation at all, convinced that something else had occurred, something darker hidden by the Navy under layers of secrecy. Rumors spread of torpedo accidents, of reactor failures, even of foreign involvement. In the absence of truth, every possibility seemed both plausible and unbearable. Among the Navy's ranks, the sense of loss was sharper. Sailors who had known the men aboard, who had trained with them, understood what it meant for a submarine to fail. They knew the routines that had carried on until the last moment, the quiet rituals of life beneath the sea, the meals, the card games, the maintenance checks, the journal entries that had been abruptly severed. They pictured their comrades in those final seconds, unaware that the ocean was closing in, that the walls around them were about to fold. And in that imagining, grief became inseparable from dread. The Pacific held their remains with indifference. Thousands of feet below, where the pressure was enough to crush bones and steel alike, the submarine lay in fragments, scattered across a seabed no human eye would ever see. It was a tomb no one could visit, a cemetery without markers, a silence without ceremony. For the Navy, it was also a reminder of the limits of their reach. They commanded fleets across the globe. They patrolled skies and coasts, but against the deepest parts of the ocean they were powerless. The graveyard of steel became both reality and symbol. It was real in the sense that somewhere in the blackness of the Pacific, the wreck of the submarine rested, a twisted monument to fragility. It was symbolic in that it marked the intersection of human ambition and natural force, a reminder that even in an age of nuclear power and global rivalry, the ocean remained unconquered. For all their secrecy, for all their strength, the Navy could not command the sea to yield what it had taken. And so the mystery persisted. Investigators spoke of probable implosion, of physics and depth of steel giving way to pressure, but their certainty never extended to proof. Without the wreck itself, every explanation remained a theory, every report provisional, every conclusion shadowed by doubt. The submarine was gone, but its story was not closed. It lingered in silence, an absence made heavier by the knowledge that beneath the Pacific stretched a grave no one could reach, holding within it the unanswered questions of 99 lives. In the months that followed the official acknowledgement of loss, fragments of information began to circulate, never enough to illuminate the full picture, yet sufficient to suggest possibilities. Investigators assembled reports in layers, combining acoustic data, engineering analyses, and testimonies from men who had once served on the same class of submarine. These fragments were stitched together into narratives that could explain what had happened, but none of those narratives held the weight of proof. The ocean had given nothing tangible, no wreckage lifted to the surface, no black box of data to read. What remained were interpretations, fragile structures built atop silence. The acoustic anomaly detected in the days after the submarine's disappearance became the centerpiece of these interpretations. Analysts described the signal as consistent with an implosion at extreme depth, and yet the recordings were blurred by distance and distortion. Each expert seemed to find in them something different: the echo of a hull collapsing, the concussion of an internal explosion, or even the reverberation of a distant undersea quake. The data was studied until the lines on the charts seemed to acquire the texture of myth, their meaning shifting according to the mind that examined them. Engineering reports offered other fragments. Some spoke of possible flaws in the vessel's design, weaknesses in components that might have failed under pressure. Others pointed to the risks of carrying weapons armed with volatile fuels, where even a small malfunction could trigger catastrophe. A few reports ventured into speculation about the reactor, that constant presence in the heart of the submarine, whose failure could unleash both silence and fear. Each report was careful, written in language that hedged against certainty. No one dared to claim knowledge they did not possess, for the truth lay thousands of feet below, sealed in steel that no diver would touch. The fragments of truth extended beyond technical documents. Classified memoranda hinted at concerns about proximity to Soviet waters, about the possibility of surveillance missions unacknowledged in official records. Though no evidence tied the disappearance to hostile action, the timing, at the height of Cold War suspicion, ensured the idea could not be dismissed. In secure rooms, officers debated scenarios they would never admit aloud in public: collisions, confrontations, miscalculations. Yet without proof, these too remained in the shadow of speculation. For the families, fragments were delivered in softer form. Letters of condolence arrived, their language carefully chosen to convey respect without detail. The Navy told them that the submarine had been lost with all hands, that recovery was impossible, that their loved ones now rested in the sea. But the families wanted more. They wanted to know how, why, where. They wanted to see evidence, to hold on to something tangible. Instead, they were given fragments that did not fit together. Rumors overheard in communities, articles in newspapers that speculated wildly, statements from officials that revealed nothing. In kitchens and living rooms, these fragments became puzzles assembled late at night, with pieces missing and edges blurred. Historians would later look back at these months as the moment when the disappearance ceased to be only a naval event and became a cultural one. The lack of closure transformed it into story, and story transformed it into legend. People remembered the submarine not simply as lost, but as vanished, swallowed by the ocean in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The fragments of truth, rather than resolving the mystery, deepened it, because each piece of information contradicted or complicated the others. And so the official record remained cautious. The submarine was declared lost, the cause unknown. The Navy acknowledged probable implosion, yet kept certain reports sealed away, citing national security. Families mourned without clarity. Analysts debated theories in corridors that would never be opened to the public. And beneath it all, the Pacific kept its silence, indifferent to the human need for explanation. The fragments did not add up to certainty, but they formed something else, the shape of absence. They revealed how much could be lost, not only in lives and steel, but in knowledge. The submarine had not merely sunk, it had carried with it its own story, its own truth, and buried it so deeply that only pieces would ever resurface. The fragments remained, scattered across reports and memories, insufficient to form a whole, yet impossible to ignore. In the years after the disappearance, the technical reports, the classified memoranda, and the endless debates about cause faded into the background of public memory. What endured most vividly were not theories about implosions or whispers of hostile action, but the lives of the men who had boarded the submarine in 1968 and never returned. 99 souls, each with their own story, had slipped beneath the surface with the vessel, And it was their absence that weighed most heavily on the families who remained. Across the country, photographs of the lost crew members became permanent fixtures in households. They hung in living rooms, stood on mantelpieces, rested in frames that grew older as the years passed. Children grew up seeing those faces as both presence and absence. The father they remembered dimly or not at all, the brother whose voice was now only an echo in someone else's memory. In time, the photographs yellowed at the edges, but they were never taken down, for to remove them would be to surrender the last fragment of presence to the silence of the ocean. Letters the men had written before deployment were read again and again. In their ordinary words, families sought meaning that had not been intended, a final phrase that seemed to foreshadow, a description of routine that now felt like farewell. The handwriting became sacred, a physical trace of a voice silenced too soon. Some wives kept those letters in boxes, sealed away but never discarded. Others placed them in drawers where they could be retrieved in moments of solitude. The words once casual became testament. Communities carried the absence as well. Towns where multiple crewmen had been raised bore the weight collectively. Streets remembered the parades of young men leaving for service, uniforms pressed, faces proud. Now they remembered them as lost together, their names carved into plaques and memorials. Schools and churches built small shrines, places where names were recited each year, where silence was observed in their memory. The ocean had taken them, but memory kept them present, if only in ritual. For the Navy, the crew became symbols of sacrifice. Their names were etched into official rolls of honor, spoken in ceremonies that framed their loss as part of the broader fabric of service. Yet for the men who had served alongside them in other deployments, their absence was sharper. They remembered not only the names, but the laughter in cramped quarters, the exhaustion after long watches, the small habits that defined a shipmate's presence. These echoes haunted them most vividly. Not the silence of the submarine, but the silence left in conversations that would never happen again. Families tried to imagine the final moments, though imagination was cruel. Some took comfort in the theory of an implosion, believing it had been swift, instantaneous, sparing the men any prolonged suffering. Others, unable to accept that, conjured different scenarios, that the crew had fought for survival in darkness, that they had held out hope until the very last breath. Each family crafted its own narrative because the truth was unknowable, and in that unknowability lay both torment and solace. As years turned into decades, the echoes of the crew remained not only in personal memory, but in history itself. Documentaries and books revisited the story, each repeating the same facts, the same fragments, yet always returning to the same conclusion. The men were gone, their resting place unreachable. The submarine had become a monument invisible, a grave hidden in the folds of the sea. But the men aboard were remembered by their names, by their faces, by the unfinished lives that history refused to let dissolve entirely. For their children, the echoes were even more complex. Some had been too young to remember their fathers. They grew up with only stories, shaped by the voices of mothers and grandparents. Others had been old enough to carry a memory, but too young to understand it fully, leaving them with impressions rather than recollections, voices half-remembered, gestures blurred by time. For them, the echoes were not only reminders of loss, but reminders of absence itself, of what life might have been had the submarine returned. The Navy's search for answers, the analysts' charts and recordings, the engineers' theories, all of these faded into footnotes. What endured most deeply were the human echoes, the laughter that no longer filled kitchens, the footsteps no longer heard in hallways, the voices silenced by the sea. The submarine had vanished, but the men aboard had not. They lingered in photographs, in letters, in memorials, in the hearts of families and the pages of history. In this way, the crew remained present. Their absence defined the story, yet their echoes ensured they were never forgotten. They lived on in silence that spoke louder than words, in memories carried across generations, in the haunting truth that the ocean had claimed them but could not erase them. By the time the official investigations were closed, the story of the vanished submarine had already drifted into history's deeper currents. The Navy filed its reports, stamped with the language of finality. The submarine was lost with all hands, the probable cause an implosion at depth, recovery impossible. Families were given the words but not the certainty. What lay beneath the Pacific remained unreachable, sealed in a grave that no diver or machine of the time could penetrate. The men had been buried not in soil but in water, beneath miles of silence. In the decades that followed, the mystery endured. New generations of submariners learned the story during their training, not as cautionary tale alone, but as reminder of the sea's absolute authority. They studied the diagrams of pressure, the mathematics of hull integrity, the procedures designed to prevent disaster. Yet in the back of every lecture lingered the unspoken truth. The ocean did not yield to calculation. It obeyed no command, no system, no vigilance. What it decided to take, it kept occasionally. Advancements in technology renewed hope of discovery. Deep-sea exploration grew more ambitious, machines capable of descending farther, cameras able to capture landscapes of the seabed once thought unreachable. Expeditions mapped trenches and ridges with greater precision, tracing features of the Pacific unseen for millions of years. Yet the submarine remained hidden, scattered perhaps across a slope, folded into a valley or lying broken in silence. The search zones were vast, the depths overwhelming, and the sea had concealed its secret too well. For the families, life had moved forward in outward appearance. Children grew into adults, widows rebuilt routines, parents aged into silence. Yet the absence never dissolved. It simply transformed into memory, one carried quietly through generations. Some visited memorials erected in honor of the crew, where names were carved into stone and spoken aloud each year. Others carried remembrance privately, through photographs that never left the walls of their homes, through letters folded and unfolded, through the persistent thought of what might have been. The men who had vanished were not forgotten. They existed in the pauses of conversations, in the empty seats at gatherings, in the silence that sometimes fell heavier than words. For historians, the case became one of the sea's enduring mysteries, recounted alongside other disappearances that had defied explanation. Yet this one carried a particular resonance, because it belonged to an age of technology, an era when nations believed they could measure and control the deep. To lose a submarine in the 19th century was tragedy. To lose one in the nuclear age was reminder. Reminder that knowledge was not mastery, that human ambition had boundaries, and that the ocean remained indifferent to both pride and sorrow. The Pacific still stretches endlessly, restless on the surface, silent in its depths. Beneath it lies a vessel that once carried 99 lives, now a tomb of steel pressed into the seabed. No one has seen it since that day in 1968. No one has touched its hull, traced the outlines of its ruin, or retrieved its story in full. It rests unseen, unvisited, unconfirmed, yet remembered. It is both real and spectral, both history and mystery, both presence and absence. The submarine's legacy is not only in the theories and the investigations, but in the silence it left behind. Silence that families carried through years of waiting. Silence that officers accepted in place of certainty. Silence that the ocean itself maintains, vast and unbroken. It is a silence that speaks, telling of the limits of power, the fragility of machines, the finality of depth. And so the ocean keeps its secrets. It holds them as it always has, without malice or mercy, without acknowledgement of the grief above. The submarine remains there still, hidden in blackness, a graveyard of steel surrounded by nothingness. The men aboard remain remembered, their absence echoing across time. The sea does not explain, does not return, does not yield. It simply holds endlessly, leaving the world above to wonder, to grieve, and to accept that some mysteries are meant to endure.